Iran is now hitting Kuwait and Bahrain, Israel is killing paramedics in Lebanon, and Washington keeps saying the war is over while still striking ships and tightening sanctions. At the same time, American voters in Tuesday's primaries were sending their own warning shot. The headline chaos is real, but the official spin is even noisier. Today's update ties together the same story from three angles: a widening regional war, a government in Washington trying to control the narrative, and a public that's getting less patient with endless foreign entanglements. Some of the coverage out there is coming from outlets with very obvious agendas, so I'm going to strip away the editorial varnish and stick to what matters: who hit whom, who got hurt, and what this means for the United States, for allies, and for everybody stuck living with the consequences. Let's start with the most dangerous development. Iranian forces say they launched missile and drone attacks against U.S. military installations in Kuwait and Bahrain, framing it as retaliation for a U.S. strike on Qeshm Island. Kuwait's defense ministry confirmed dozens of missiles and drones were launched toward its territory, and later reports said drones hit the passenger terminal at Kuwait International Airport, killing one person and injuring more than 60. That part matters, because this is where the rhetoric collides with reality. CENTCOM says it intercepted some of the incoming missiles and drones, and it says no American personnel were harmed. Iran, on the other hand, claims the strikes were more effective than U.S. officials admit. That's the pattern in these incidents. Everyone declares success, and civilians are left sorting out the damage. Then came the U.S. counterpunch at sea. American forces struck a commercial tanker after it ignored warnings and kept heading toward Iran's Karg Island. U.S. officials are also bragging that they've disabled multiple commercial vessels and redirected a lot more under the blockade of Iranian ports. That's not a minor footnote. That's a blockade, and blockades are acts of war in everything but the press briefing. President Trump tried to downplay the Iranian response, saying the attacks were maybe slightly provoked. That's one way to describe it if you're trying very hard not to say the obvious. If one side bombs first, then intercepts the reply, then hits shipping lanes, then calls the whole thing peace, the language is doing a lot of heavy lifting. Secretary of State Marco Rubio added to the confusion by telling the Senate that the war is over, while also insisting that any sanctions relief for Iran depends on nuclear concessions. So which is it? Over, or still being actively managed through military pressure and economic warfare? From where I'm standing, it looks less like the end of a war and more like a pause button with missiles still in the machine. If this kind of straight-to-the-point breakdown is useful, hit the like button and subscribe so you don't miss the next update. The other part worth watching is nuclear diplomacy. The IAEA's Rafael Grossi said many of Iran's active nuclear operations have stopped since the fighting began, which is a serious development whether you think the pressure campaign is justified or not. But again, that doesn't mean the problem is solved. It means the conflict is now bleeding into the nuclear file, the shipping lanes, the regional airspace, and the US economy all at once. Now to Lebanon, where the reporting gets uglier by the hour. Israeli strikes on Wednesday reportedly killed paramedics, including 2 from an ambulance hit directly in Shahur, and another medic from the same rescue network was killed in a separate drone strike. A civil defense team responding to an earlier strike was also hit. That's not just collateral damage in the abstract. That's the people who run toward explosions getting caught in them. Some of the coverage on this comes from sources that are openly ideological, and you can hear the conclusion before the facts are even finished being listed. But you do not need a partisan filter to see how bad it looks when ambulances are struck, rescue crews are hit, and entire families are pushed off their land. One of the most disturbing reports is from Ain Arab, where Israeli soldiers reportedly went door to door ordering residents out of their homes at gunpoint. A woman described being told, "You either leave right now or you die." That line should stop everyone cold, regardless of where they stand politically. This is the kind of sentence that gets remembered for years, because it sounds like the collapse of every civilized excuse in one breath. Israel's campaign in southern Lebanon has already displaced more than 1 million people, and reporting says roughly 60 villages near the border have been devastated or emptied. Amnesty International argues that the displacement orders don't amount to lawful warnings and they qualify as unlawful transfer. Israel and its defenders will insist this is all about security. Maybe some of it is, but when entire communities are told to leave or die, the burden of proof gets heavy very quickly. Trump's own comments show how messy this has become. He reportedly told Netanyahu to cool it, even calling him crazy in one private exchange, because the fighting in Lebanon is complicating his wider Iran diplomacy. That's not diplomacy in the classic sense. That's crisis management with a phone. And the battlefield math is still expanding. Lebanon says thousands have been killed and wounded since the current phase of fighting escalated, and Israel continues to carry out strikes even after ceasefire language is used in Washington. That word, ceasefire, is starting to sound less like a stop sign and more like a marketing term. From Lebanon, the line runs straight into Gaza and the occupied West Bank. Israel kept attacking Gaza on Wednesday with reports of additional deaths, including 3 more people killed in one day. Children there are reportedly surviving on as little as 6 liters of water a day, which is a number so low it sounds fictional until you remember that it isn't. The Gaza ceasefire story is another example of how official language can hide the actual scale of violence. One of the reports says Israel has violated the ceasefire thousands of times through airstrikes, shelling, shootings, raids, and destruction of property. The exact counting method depends on the source, and some outlets are clearly approaching the story with a predetermined conclusion. Still, the broader reality is hard to deny. Civilians keep dying, aid remains restricted, and the ceasefire framework is barely functioning. Hamas's military spokesman saying that a moment of truth has arrived fits the mood on the ground, even if you don't like the source. When talks continue while airstrikes continue, negotiations become little more than a public relations layer over the battlefield. Then there's the West Bank, where Israel approved more than 2,000 new settlement units. That's the part many people outside the region gloss over, because it doesn't have the same immediate shock value as missile strikes. but strategically, it matters just as much. You cannot keep expanding settlements in occupied territory and then act surprised when nobody believes you're serious about a final status peace. The bigger problem is that the entire region is being pulled into a logic of permanent emergency. The United States is talking about training the Lebanese army, sanctioning Iran's crypto exchanges, policing shipping lanes, and backing Israeli military operations all at once. That's not a coherent foreign policy. That's a pile of reactions. And when governments start substituting reactions for strategy, taxpayers eventually get the bill. There's also a broader American interest here that gets ignored by the usual cable news cheerleading. The US should not be sleepwalking into open-ended commitments, especially when the same officials insisting they're restoring stability keep creating the next crisis. A country with a national debt this large and a border this neglected has no business pretending it can bankroll every regional war forever. Back in Washington, the fight over presidential war powers is finally getting some attention. The House passed a war powers resolution aimed at ending the Iran conflict, with a few Republicans joining Democrats. That vote may be symbolic for now, but it still matters. Congress is supposed to authorize war, not just clap politely while the executive branch improvises. The Senate, however, is still the bottleneck, and the administration has been playing games with the language. Officials argue the war is somehow over because there's a fragile ceasefire, even while US ships are still hitting targets and Iran is responding. That kind of legal gymnastics is exactly why the War Powers Act exists in the first place. And then there's the larger pattern in the current administration: acting DNI appointments, sanctions campaigns, military cooperation bills, and a general willingness to blur the line between temporary emergency powers and permanent policy. Trump naming Housing Finance official Bill Pulte to act as Director of National Intelligence is another reminder that the whole system is being run with a lot of placeholders and very little transparency. The other big Washington story is the continued push to lock in the US-Israel security relationship even more deeply. A new bill in the House would formalize a partnership model based on Netanyahu's own proposal, moving away from traditional aid and toward joint development and co-production. That may sound sleek on paper, but in practice it can make accountability even harder. Once the relationship is buried deeper inside defense procurement and joint programs, public oversight gets weaker, not stronger. Tuesday's primary results also showed that foreign policy is no longer a niche issue voters ignore until November. The war, the spending, the borderless nature of these commitments, all of it is seeping into local politics. Meanwhile, the Supreme Court letting Alabama keep a congressional map that lower courts said intentionally discriminated against black voters is another reminder that institutions are not exactly inspiring confidence right now. Add in CBS firing Scott Pelley, and you get a media ecosystem and a political system both under strain. A few other headlines round out the picture. Ukrainian drone strikes killed civilians on a bus in Donetsk. Fighting in South Darfur reportedly killed at least 50 civilians. In Argentina, outrage over a teenage girl's killing has reignited protests against femicide and the Malay government's hard-right cultural agenda. And in the Americas, Trump is threatening a 25% tariff on Brazilian imports while also backing sanctions on Congolese militia leaders and clashing with Cuba over new sanctions. Different countries, different crises, same underlying theme. Governments keep using force, tariffs, sanctions, and ideological messaging to solve problems that keep getting bigger. Here's the short version. Iran's strike on Kuwait and Bahrain shows the regional conflict is still active no matter what Washington calls it. Lebanon is paying a brutal human cost, especially when paramedics and civilians are caught in strikes and villages are emptied. And in the US, Congress is finally pushing back a little on war powers, but not enough to stop the machinery unless voters keep the pressure on. If you want more news breakdowns that cut through the spin, hit like, subscribe, and turn on notifications. And drop a comment. Should the US keep getting pulled into these regional fights, or is it time for Congress to take back control before the next escalation becomes the next permanent war?